The UN Special Rapporteur on the right of everyone to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health has written an urgent letter of appeal to Israel on Human Rights Council Resolution 1521. The Special Rapporteur, Dr Tlaleng Mofokeng, says she's received concerning allegations related to violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law in the ongoing conflict in Gaza. This particularly alleged attacks on hospitals and healthcare facilities and healthcare workers since the escalation of the conflict on the 7th of October 2023. The UN Special Rapporteur on Health Rights, Dr Tlaleng Mofokeng, joins us now in studio. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you.
So just looking at what you're saying, that these violations not only have deprived every individual the right to life and security, but are not arbitrarily deprived of his or her rights to life. So in layman's terms, what are we talking about? Because obviously when we talk about these UN resolutions, they are steeped in law and not really accessible to the rest of us to unpack.
Absolutely, and I think it's important to, of course, contextualize my intervention in this particular instance, in that one of the most important things for independent experts is to advise the UN on any emerging human rights crisis and be an early warning system. And so as early as the 8th of October, having watched the escalation in the recent episode, one was already concerned that the healthcare sector itself would be overwhelmed by the number of casualties, but it quickly emerged that in fact healthcare workers themselves and the healthcare infrastructure was being deliberately targeted. And so if you look at the Israel as a member state of the United Nations, they ratified in 1991 the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as economic, cultural, and rights, and those specifically speak to the right to life. As we explained, they speak to the right of everyone to the highest attainable standard of health. And in the context of the violence, even before October 7th, Palestinians were not able to realize their right to health. And with this escalation, it has gotten worse.
And we'll get back to that and your involvement, but in your letter you speak about prima facie evidence. And again, I go back to the fact that this is legalese. I know it's important to, but for us who've been watching this conflict, we are, especially those who are outside of the news media, spared of the horrific scenes. But the importance of stipulating it in that manner.
It's important because as the Special Rapporteur, I receive first-hand information, either complaints of ongoing human rights violation or potential, but also historical violations. And so what started to happen very early on after 7th of October is that I got first-hand account and complaints that in fact people's human rights to life, to dignity, to accessing healthcare services, but the healthcare workers' rights themselves to be doctors and practice medicine was also being obliterated. And we know that under the right to health, one needs only not just access to healthcare, but underlying determinants like food, water, sanitation, electricity, and fuel to keep the healthcare infrastructure going. So what was happening then is that I was receiving those allegations coupled with some evidence of what people were alleging. So that letter dated 4th of December to Israel had to remain confidential for a month of time to allow the member states to directly engage with me and provide some of the answers and evidence to some of the questions and concerns that I have raised. And of course, one of them being at that moment already an immediate ceasefire as early as the 4th of December.
And we'll come back to what response you received and how the latest developments may have impacted on that. But I also want to backtrack to the beginning of your mandate. You say obviously you received it during COVID times, so there was a pre-existing crisis with regards to the Gaza enclave and occupied Palestinian areas, and you were talking to Israel about that. Tell us about the conversation and what you're expressing to them about their responsibility as Israel.
So there's a number of methods available to independent experts, and one of them, of course, is direct communication with the member state through communication letters. And of course, this particular one having been an urgent appeal, but there have been other communications. And during the COVID pandemic, one of the issues that we had raised is that, the UN Charter, the Human Rights Declaration, and all of these covenants speak about non-discrimination. And it was important to remind Israel as the occupying power in Palestine of their obligations under the right to health, in that they shouldn't limit access to, of course, diagnostic treatments and also preventative measures for COVID. And so for many of us, the escalation and the acute episode of 7th October happens within that historical context of settler colonialism and imperialism and land dispossession that Palestinians have been experiencing.
And what was the response of Israel when you reminded them of their responsibilities as per the Geneva Convention?
Look, I think for the 7th of October, no one can be surprised that there hasn't been any engagement in a positive instance. Of course, the letter is received, we know, and it forms part, I think, for me, of an illustration of the recalcitrant nature of the kind of violence that Israel is meting out onto Palestinians, and that, of course, we remain in hope, and we always show up and on hope that justice will be done, and ultimately there will be an end to the occupation. But when there's a lack of that cooperation, when there's a lack of that cooperation, even with a multilateral system that's supposed to be holding member states accountable to each other, when that fails, the question is where to next, and hence South Africa's step to the ICJ was very, very important.
And here we're talking about humanitarianism, yet this conflict in itself and these recent events have been so highly politicized, it's so emotive. But if you're speaking to our audience out there, so that you can just explain to them why you and the experts that you work with, who have boundless amounts of experience and exposure, say this is a war on health. This is a conflict and an attack on health that you have never before seen.
And I think it's very important that healthcare workers, health infrastructure, key infrastructure necessary for civilian life is protected under international human rights law, under the humanitarian rights law. The problem with Palestine, and I think it's a context or a particular point that because the violence has been so normalized over so many decades, we forget that Palestinians are living already in an open-air prison. 2 million people were already displaced by October 7th. Right now, we are talking about 1.7 million people internally displaced, more than 8,000 who are still unaccounted for under the rubble. We're talking about doctors and nurses and healthcare workers who have been killed, murdered in cold blood. Some have been enforcedly disappeared, others have been tortured, and we know that those are, of course, already violations of international law. So we don't need the court to tell us that. We know that those are violations. What we need is an immediate ceasefire. We need someone who can make that happen.
And when you talk to EU leaders, because you recently addressed them to express these concerns about this, just trying to paint a picture of what it's like to live in an enclave, as you say, of the diameters where hospitals, where the injured, people who are fleeing from the war are taking refuge, it's directly hit. What was the response? Was there any resonance with the seriousness of the nature of this crisis?
I think I was stuck between a few things. One is that we're trying to appeal to morality of world leaders who clearly have none, who, for them, state of colonialism and land dispossession and racism is what they actually are fighting for. They are literally aiding and funding the right of Israel to be a settler colonialist. And so that's a problem. And that is a point that I raised with the EU leaders to say, as a bloc, you do have, of course, a lot of authority and a lot of power. We didn't anticipate all of the announcements they made in response to the UNRWA and how they've all cut, well, many of them have cut off funding and threatening to cut off funding even to the UN agencies, which is something that we've never heard of. And that kind of level of commitment to some of the most despicable behavior we've never seen in history. And I'm not sure, sometimes I'm more hopeful than other days. But what I think was important for me to portray was that Gaza was already a humanitarian crisis. Appealing for a humanitarian ceasefire is not going to help Gaza. We were already in a humanitarian crisis. People were already depending on food aid and living in camps. What we need now is a complete and immediate ceasefire, a process that will lead to the Palestinians to reclaim their land and to live a life of dignity and self-determination. In the context of the current violence, in the current occupation, there cannot be that moment for the Palestinians to actually self-determine. So another humanitarian corridor, another humanitarian ceasefire is not going to get Gaza what it needs when the entire civil infrastructure, people have been killed. What it will need in terms of support and aid, I don't think the world has ever actually quantified the amount of destruction that will then be required to be repaired.
The fact that the ICJ did not call for an immediate ceasefire is something that the United Nations, the General Assembly, the Security Council have been grappling with, struggling not only in terms of the writ, but political will. How is that likely to affect your job going forward? As you mentioned, with the allegations of UNRWA, Israel very strongly saying, well, it just goes to show that even these health officials are taking part in these terrorist acts that Hamas and other militia are involved in. How does that impact your work appealing to political leaders that there are people dying, that and it's been contentious that these acts amount to genocide?
I think perhaps what we need to do is realize that humanizing Palestinian people in this moment is actually very, very important. For far too long, people who live under the crushing weight of oppression, structural discrimination, racism, and what we have witnessed in Gaza, even the epistemicide, the literal destruction of knowledge systems in Gaza, in the way that universities were demolished, even online archives are no longer there. That is a deliberate destruction of a people in many different ways: their culture, their language, political, their identity. We need to realize that part of justice for Palestinian people is humanizing them. It's rejecting the narrative that Palestinians or people from Gaza are default terrorists. We must also acknowledge that the United Nations has declared this decade a decade of peace. And member states have agreed that they will not only look at issues of conflict and protracted war, they will also look at root causes. And this was a moment in time where I think the multilateral system should have put its money where its mouth is, because this is exactly what they have declared, is that they would look at root causes, and that peace ultimately can only happen because of liberation.
Thank you so much for your time. That is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights to Health, SR Dr Tlaleng Mofokeng, speaking about an appeal made to Israel on the continuing unraveling health crisis in Gaza, to Israel, the appeal to Israel and EU leaders.